get into the details of Teen Intervene, I'll walk you through it. You may know you have, there's a PDF version of the manual that you can print out for yourself. I'm walking you through the various components of it. I think as a handout, you might also have the worksheets or some of the questionnaires that are supplemental materials. All of those are also in that PDF. But I walk you through all the components. So, not too surprising, Teen Intervene, as you know, is modeled after the principles I've been talking about, motivational interviewing approaches, and plenty of stage of change, and another component, cognitive behavioral. So it would fit the category of MET CBT, if you remember from this morning, a combo of treatment interventions that in the meta-analysis looked quite favorable, taking advantage of those. So their background, I think these are new slides. You may not have them in your handout because I finally summarized. Oh, good. Excellent. 2 studies that are in, have been conducted to evaluate Teen Intervene. Bottom line is, at 6 and 12 months, the change from baseline to those follow-up points are favorable in terms of reduction in number of drug use days. For both versions of Teen Intervene, a Teen Intervene that had 2 sessions only the adolescent version versus the version that is the full Teen Intervene, which is 2 adolescent and 1 parent. So both of those conditions, you show nice pre to post change that is above and beyond what the assessment-only control group had. So compared to assessment only, and there's a little improvement in that group, but you get a statistically significant improvement, either version of the intervention. You get the most improvement. Sometimes it's statistically significant, sometimes not, but the trend is always you get the better outcome when you have added the parent component. So if you do all 3, you're most likely optimizing outcome for your client. But if you don't get the parent to be involved, or you realize you have to call an audible and accept the teenager's condition of, I'll do it, but I don't want my parent involved, which can happen. If you have to go that route, you still forge ahead because the odds are you're still going to have an opportunity for benefit. So what is improved also at outcome that mediates improvement in drug use, reductions in drug use, improvement in problem solving, and use of community services. So problem solving improved in the teenagers. You get that from both conditions, but it looks like the extra benefit of the parent condition is that there's a slight higher rate of additional services used by the family for counseling and help after the intervention is done. So the follow-up period, we were also measuring what other exposure and interest in services occurred. So Teen Intervene might be providing a motivation for the family to continue on with other services. And that, of course, occurred most likely when you had the parent condition or the parent involvement. So 2 mediating factors. Here's abstinence rates. BI-Y means that's just the 2-session, youth only. BI-YP, that's the 3-session. And I'm going to talk about the 3-session. And then there's the assessment-only control group. So that's abstinence rates at 6 months for alcohol, marijuana, and the time window, use the assessment measure called timeline followback, and we use the 3-month time frame. So at 6 months, you're asking the person about their last 90 days of use or non-use, and you're getting a detailed calendar review, and these are the abstinence rates. So a reminder, you don't get, 80-90% abstinence, and you also got some abstinence with the assessment-only control group. So none of the teenagers were abstinent at baseline, just so they all had been users within a 90-day window prior to treatment.
This is 100% abstinence?
For the 90 days. Right. So, we balance it with, well, how reliable if we did the whole 60 or 6-month period, that could be unreliable, and the literature likes 90-day windows for teenagers using timeline fallback. So, right, there's a little gap there, not knowing exactly what happened before.
Do you do random drug testing?
No, not random.
So this is just self-reporting?
Right, they get drug tested while we do the assessment, but that's not random.
Right. But then afterwards, do you?
The match is basically you get more self-reporting of drug use than what the test tells you, almost all the time. I think only one case did somebody say I didn't use and the drug test was positive for a drug. It's a nice validator, but it turns out for researchers, you don't usually get more yield of information. You get more self-report that's telling you either I have or haven't used. In part, I guess, because we're confidential. We're not giving any information to parents. So we're hoping teenagers are willing to be honest, because there's not any negative consequence they tell us they're using. They also are being assessed by not the counselor. It's another person, independent. And that could add dynamics, of course, if the counselor were asking. As that could, what would that lead to? A lot of people saying, well, maybe I'm going to give a better story because I like the counselor and I don't want to disappoint him or her. That could give you an inflated view of things. So if you want references, here's the 2 articles. One of them is in the literature already, 2007. The other one's in press. Hopefully that's supposed to be out in 2012. Yeah, I think we're not going to make 2011. It should be out early in 2012. But also you can find out about the data by going to NREP. There's the website, NREP, National Registry of Effective Programs and Practices. And you type in Teen Intervene in the search window, and then it'll direct you to the summary page that summarizes the data. If people wanted to purchase a Hazelden version of Teen Intervene that has some nice user-friendly features, they can go to that website. But you don't need to purchase it. You guys have the manual. Hazelden has polished it up a bit, has some interesting features, nothing though that impacts administration. You guys have all of the user-friendly features that we used in our research. Okay, before I leap into the actual intervention, anything on outcome or the evaluation data? All right. So to review, 3 sessions is the full version. First 2 are with the teenager and then followed by 1 with a parent, with the hope that you can have a small summit meeting, we call it, with the teenager and the parent at the end of the last session. Now, number of sessions can depend upon how much time you have to do them. So in some school settings, they don't have a full 60 minutes, so sometimes they have to break off and finish the full first session in 2 meetings, for example, perhaps having a day or 2 in between. But let's say you have luxury of roughly 60 minutes. The idea is you should be able to do all of the content within 3 sessions and have roughly 7 to 10 days in between sessions, because you want to have some time for the teenager to do some homework, and then you want to have a little time to see how things are going before you have the parent. You can save time on both the first teenage session and the first parent session if you can have the client questionnaire completed before there's the meeting, because it's just a self-report, both instruments, and you don't have to waste time in the session having the teenager fill it out or the parent fill it out. And then you can use the information quickly in that first session. So time saver, depending on your setting. If you're a clinic and you have people fill out forms beforehand anyways, part of intake, you can put those questionnaires into the mix. Question for the group: why did we have 2 sessions, adolescent first, and then the third session being the parent as the third one, when we could have done it all other different kinds of combinations? let's say we were stuck with, or saying that we were going to stay with 3 sessions. Let's say that was our first decision point, but then, and we wanted a mix of teenage and parent, so we made that decision point. But why go with 2 adolescent first and the third one parent? We surely could have done it a lot of different other ways. What do you think was our thinking? From a motivational enhancement standpoint.
Like a bonding between counselor and,
Bonding between counselor and teenager. And if we had the parent too early, what would happen? Perhaps.
like, it's like, you're gonna take my parent's side, you're not gonna listen to me.
Right. It might look like the adults are aligning and the teenagers losing the feel that, hey, this is something I have an opportunity to have some control over and be involved and centered with. Right. That was the thought. There are some advantages of going different ways with this for information purposes and other things, but so we weighted it heavily towards this decision of adolescent first for both sessions. Now, we could have had adolescent first and then parent next, but we like the idea of building momentum with a teenager, having a homework assignment, and then in 7-10 days you're reviewing it, seeing how it goes, and continuing the momentum that hopefully you've established with a teenager. So it played out that way. Okay, first session has several components. This is, roughly speaking, what happens. You're introducing the program. You're either completing or reviewing the alcohol drug use history, as well as some motivational problem recognition attitudes. There's the pros and cons exercise or decisional balance. It's called either one, decisional balance or pros and cons. And then there's the getting a temperature reading of their willingness to change, setting goals, and then a wrap-up including a review of the homework assignments. So let me walk you through all of the various steps. There's several of them. The manual provides a lot of suggested script for you. So if you're an experienced counselor, you aren't going to need some of this suggested script, but to learn it, or if you're new with teenagers, we hold your hand a little bit in providing some detail. So the manual discusses some ways to introduce the intervention, and essentially, setting the stage for self-efficacy is important, responsibility for changes with you. This is a client-centered approach. I'm here to help you. I can't tell you what to do. And you also want to make sure that the teenager is on board with the rules of confidentiality. Now, usually this is established with everybody at the front end of a counseling visit, but it can be useful just to review it with a teenager that you are not going to pipeline information to the parent. You can't box yourself in entirely into a corner, correct? Because you may be mandated to report something if something comes up in the suicide or abuse category. But it's useful to remind the teenager that you're there to help him or her and not there to provide secret or private information to the parent. So there's the client questionnaire. As I mentioned, if you can administer it beforehand, it's a plus. If not, then you hand over this questionnaire that is got 2 parts to it. The first part is the drug use history section, and the second part is measuring problem recognition. So it's our first shot at trying to see how much the teenager's interested in changing. We call it problem recognition, but you also could probably consider it a willingness to change scale. Now, some people don't give part 1 because they've already got enough alcohol drug use history, because maybe you've done a screening or an assessment prior, but we put it in there in case you hadn't done much, and it's a very brief frequency checklist. It's patterned after the Monitoring the Future survey items, so it has some validity to it. Here's some of the first items. Have you had alcohol beverages? Have you used marijuana? Have you used other drugs? You might wonder, why are we asking these time frames? Never, 1 to 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 9, 10 to 12. That's the way the Monitoring the Future people ask about frequency. There's a lot of history behind it. I won't go into it, but it is research-based, asking in that way. So it can be helpful. Asking about past 12 months, getting a 1-year time window. Obviously, you may have additional information. The last part of part 1 also allows you to at least get the teenager to checklist what other drugs they've used. So, you know, it could get lengthy if you have all these drugs and every item is inquiring about frequency. So we decided to make it a little short, but it can be of value to find out what they might be using in addition, although they don't have to mark frequency for those. Obviously, it could be a follow-up question if you like. But part 2 is the questions pertaining to sort of how much do you think you have a problem, how much you think you have help. It's 2.5 pages all the way to 21. So you notice that you can score this and get a total score, but you don't have to. Because pretty soon I'm going to show you how to use the questionnaire and lock onto some of the key items and use those to guide an interview to get into discussion with a teenager about how much they might view their behavior as a problem, to what extent they might be willing to consider change. But get it completed either beforehand or at the front end so you can have that raw material to be used pretty soon. Not right away, but pretty soon. So I'm not going to review all the items with you because we'll go back to some of the key ones quite quickly. All right, step 3 is the next exercise, and this is the pros and cons or decisional balance. And it's a guided interview. You have, the manual gives you a way to introduce it, and you also have a worksheet so you can fill out the answers that they give you. And this is the opportunity to allow discussion of their perceived negatives and positives. And as you know already, you start out with the pros. And why do you start out with the pros? Because, boy, motivational interviewing, people say, that's a good door opener. You're not arousing defensiveness. And for a teenager in a discussion with an adult, I think it's even more powerful in that way. They usually don't get asked this. What do you like about using? What are the good things? What else? What are the positive effects of using? You don't ask, why do you use? That one's a tough one. I'm not sure what you could make of it. It's not why to use, it's what do you like? What are the positives? What are the good things? So you're likely going to get answers here. Even if it's, what do you think the most typical one is? I'll engage the group for a moment. What do you think are some of the typical ones? Okay, get high. So I would follow up with, so tell me why you like to get high.
Feels good.
Very good, thank you. I mean, that's a little bit more psychology. And so what about the feeling good do you like? See if you can get the person to say, well, it's because yes, it helps me when I'm dealing with shyness in social situations, or helps me with boredom or stress. Exactly. See if you can peel, this is the old peeling away the onion part. Can you get a little deeper? Get high, feel good. Boy, I'd sure like to know, well, what is the feeling specific that they're aiming towards, because they're probably trying to get away from something else. So feeling, yes?
At that point, do we suggest other alternatives to achieve that feeling?
At that point, you file that up here. You're gonna draw on that soon. I would say, because it's very early. You might only be 10 minutes into your, it depends, of course, what clinical setting. If you did the intake on the teenager, maybe you've already spent an hour or so with him or her, but it's so early. File this away. And by the way, as I mentioned earlier, this is the set of questions where you're likely going to have some grist for the mill, so another Midwestern phrase. You are likely going to have some raw material that you're going to be able to use for setting goals, so you start filing it. And you probably will get answers that fall into 3 categories. I think you've all mentioned them. One is in the category of social benefits. I use it because it just makes partying more fun, or I have more fun with my friends. And I think related to yours, it helps me with my shyness even, or at least helps me with my social confidence. That's in the social category. Number 2, some kind of self-medication, anxiety, depression, or boredom. Or ADHD kids, they might like it because it helps calm them, helps direct their attention. Both alcohol and tobacco are interesting drugs for ADHD because they both can lead to reports by ADHD youth that helps them, at least temporarily, with their attention problem. Anyways, and then you have the third category, which is, you mentioned, kind of a general coping skills. And that could be social coping, but it could be other kinds of coping. Stress-related, things are going on at home, at school, I'm being bullied, maybe it helps me cope just so I can feel part of my social network. There's a combination of social benefits and coping. Anyway, you're likely going to get an answer roughly in those three categories or a mix. And teenagers that tend to have problems with drugs, they say more, if they're willing to talk, than I just use it because it's my recreational outlet and it's so I can party better. If you get teenagers saying that, that's usually a teenager that doesn't fall into, I got a big problem with drugs. The teenagers that say, I'm using it as some kind of coping crutch or to help benefit some emotional issue in my life, then you're starting to get more into youngsters that are having a clinical problem with chemicals. And I would make a case or merit more attention for an intervention. Anyway, that's what probably you're going to get. All of those are great news. This is where you say to yourself, oh good, I'm getting stuff, I can write stuff down, because you're going to be able to use it soon to build some homework or help the teenager develop some goals. Now, we encourage you to try the other side of the fence, see what they say about this. So you see how we lead off with, what don't you like as much? Not what is the negatives or what are, what's the downside of drug? What don't you like as much? So maybe they can give you some insights. Maybe it's just the acute things. Well, gee, sometimes I wake up the next morning, I got a hangover. That isn't as helpful. Maybe you're getting some consequences, even if it's the adult world around them hassling them. That's still kind of good news for you, because you can see if you can use that as leverage. But to be honest, you often don't get much here, and that's all right. Whether it's the life of being a teenager in modern America, whether it's the maturity level, whether it's the self-report phenomena, whether it's the counseling context, maybe all of those are at play, but often you just don't get a lot of input here from teenagers. As opposed to adults, you tend to get more. Anyway, you also could probe more. So we encourage you could do some more probing. What you could ask, step out of your current lifestyle and tell us what would be the good things if you stopped using, or what would be the bad things. So if somebody doesn't give you any negatives about using, maybe they would, you could get some information if you flip-flopped it and just say, well, what are the bad things if you stopped using? That would kind of tell you what might be the negatives. What about your friends? What about your parents? You can probe about other people's perception. So it's a way to restructure the line of questioning. You might get some more insights. I'm surprised how many teenagers tell us friends say, the teenagers saying that they have friends that are starting to get worried about their use. That's excellent leverage, especially if it's a decent friend. Even though that friend might be a user, some kids, of course, are outliers, and they're making their friends a little worried because they're going over their top with their use. The parent thing is interesting. It might just give you a chance to figure out what you might be up against when you meet with a parent. Because you might get the teenager to talk about parents in general here, not just about their using. So what might a teenager say that gives you a little window on what's going on at home? My parents don't care about anything I do. My parents don't know about anything I do. Or my parents are always on me with everything. They're always haranguing me, and I'm not even using half the time, and I'm getting blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I give you a little insight. Might scare you from doing the third session, but it might also give you some important clinical insights about how to shape some of that third session. So it's a valuable tool. This is, as I mentioned earlier today, if you only had 15 minutes or so with an individual who's a drug user, this would be what I'd roll out and see if you could get some insight, and you surely could start to develop some goals with any individual after you get information from this. And so it's the lead. It gives you some raw material. So you're going to be filing away things here to use soon with setting goals. And so we've got worksheets you can write down, the pros, the cons. There's even a second part of the worksheet, pros of not using or changing, and the cons of not using or changing, which can many times might just be the flip side of what you already know. Okay, More exercise. You can see we pack in a lot of exercises so you have structure in this first session, and so the teenager has some things to respond to. And you're not having to fill in with clinical insight and move the change process along with inherent skills we all have, but we're trying to set this up so it's we're providing a lot of structure for you to move it along in an efficient way. So there is already some now insight you have about what might be the functional value of drug use. So what's another important thing about drug use that has been discovered in the literature? Well, okay, yes, it has functional value in people, but it also has a strong environmental or contextual facet to it. Most people are using under certain conditions or have certain triggers, and that leads to cravings. So the idea is to give the teenager first some general insight about this phenomenon. They might not really realize it. Later you're going to use it to see if you can connect triggers and cravings to goals. But so this part of the system is getting awareness or increasing insight about this issue, triggers and cravings. So the idea here is you have this worksheet that you are reading aloud these typical triggers that occur for teenagers. This comes from the literature. And you want to get a chance to see if the teenager can respond to them and see if they are relevant to him or her. So this is a guided interview that you're adding and giving the teenager all the material. You're just trying to get them to comment whether that makes sense for them or not. So it's not a section where you're saying, tell me about the things that trigger your onset of use or the situations in which you use a lot. No, we're going to give you the typical triggers, and you use that to get the teenager to comment on whether that makes sense for him or her. So, of course, you can follow up when they're saying yes and ask for more details. This is a chance for you to add some of your own personalized feature to it. But the list here is a list that represents pretty much what the literature says are things that teenagers have reported or researchers have discovered. Escape, relaxation, socialization, improved self-image, romance, to heck with it, we've changed the language of that, to heck with it, no controls, or other. So teenager might also have some other examples. So this will give you an idea of what's the setting, what's the conditions while they're using. And of course, so now you might at this point have insight about what might be driving the use functionally, what purpose is the drug use serving, and you might now also have some insight about when and where. Now, you are welcome to also, if you feel like you're not getting much from the teenager on this self-guided interview, we've got this worksheet here of 4 scenarios where we're providing a brief description of what's happening and seeing if you get the teenager to discuss about what they might do in that situation. These scenarios are set up to indicate, well, there's a little trigger or an opportunity for a craving to occur, and how would the person respond if they were trying not to use? Or how might they respond if they're trying to, if they don't care about not use, they're okay to succumb to the trigger. There are 4 of them there. Most people don't go through all 4, and you don't really need to do them if you already felt like, yeah, I got some good connection with the teenager when I went through the more structured part, because you really just want to see if you can get some insight about that teenager's contextual basis for their drug use. And of course, an open discussion means that teenagers probably learning about it. So use this if you realize, boy, I didn't get much. Let's try some of these scenarios, see if I can get him or her to talk about them. So one is about seeing parents, one's about being at a party, one's about reacting if you got a bad grade on a test under stress, and another one about stress related to a school presentation. Okay. All right, now it's time to step back a little bit and not learn more about those contextual factors, but to use the client worksheet that was filled out as a way to start to gauge your perception of the teenager's willingness to change. So it's already been completed either before the meeting or at the front end of session 1. You pull it out. Don't worry about the total score. You can always score it later if you want. The idea is to take some of the items, look at the responses, and engage in a interview, a discussion about why did they answer the way they did. Tell me more about why you answered that. So we think that there are, if I got 5, yes, 5 good items in the problem recognition that whether they answered in the agree or disagree direction might be interesting. And so these are the ones we've highlighted. Surely you could choose other ones, but it's 7, 10, 12, and then on the next page I'll show you. 7, I want to change my life and get away from alcohol and other drugs. Well, if they agree or strongly agree, that's good news, interesting news. Of course, you can ask the person to talk more about that. If they disagree, what might you follow up with? So that you don't just let that item lay. What might you follow up with? It's easy to follow up with, oh, you agree to that. That's great. When did you start thinking about that? Tell me more about it. But you might get a lot of disagrees. What could you say as a follow-up?
I'd be tempted to develop discrepancy. Well, you talked about some other...
There, excellent. Anything they might have said that was a negative, bring that up. Time to develop discrepancy. Exactly. Has anyone else ever told you you ought to change? You could always step out of their life and find out of somebody else. Even if they complain about that person, say they don't care about that person's opinion, useful to get knowledge of that. Have they ever thought about it? That kind of thing. I need help for my chemical problems. Well, anything in the agreement is good news. You reaffirm it, self-support, self-efficacy. And if they disagree, have you ever thought you needed help? Boy, you were saying earlier, you see if there's a discrepancy. Of course, if they just say strongly disagree and they've never given a negative and you think you're at rock bottom 0 with their interest in changing and they're just confirming it, don't get too discouraged. There's still room to work with him or her. I can control my alcohol or other drug use. Well, anytime you get somebody to agree to that, you always want to ask, so what does that mean for you? You follow up with, so give me an example how you could control it. Now, does that mean, oh yeah, I was able to control by stopping at my 6th beer and not going to 10? Is that what they mean? Or they mean, yeah, I didn't drink because I knew I had to drive. And I was going to be the designated driver and one of those is pretty good news. One of them is not as good news. If they disagree, that's very interesting. Oh, so you can't control your alcohol and drug use. Tell me more what you mean by that. That sounds like, surely that's a developed discrepancy point. That sounds like that could be a problem if you say you can't control it. Of course, like I say, they could control it even though they're using a lot. Control doesn't mean that they're able to stop. 18 and 19, I need help to stop using alcohol or other drugs. Good news if they give an agreement. Again, you get to perhaps develop discrepancy or just find out what you might already be knowing, that you might be up against some barriers here. I am willing to give up my old friends so I can stop using. If they give an agreement there, great news for you. Most kids will say no, and that just means you got the usual. I might have a teenager that has a lot of drug-using friends, and this could be a problem with them trying to get drug-free or trying to reduce their use. But in the odd opportunity, you get an agreement there, you've got to ask more about, so tell me about those friends that you're willing to not hang around with. And tell me about the friends that don't use. By the way, if you get a disagree there, you say, well, are there any friends that you have that aren't using? Do you hang around with them at all? Do you have any social life with non-drug using friends? A chance to at least get an assessment on that. Okay, so we picked that set. You're welcome to try others. We thought those provide grist for the mill, guided interview. Whether you're going to agree or disagree, you've got a chance, I think, to follow up with some more discussion and get an idea of what you're up against. So, since change has been in the recently discussed here, the idea is now to get their rating on the 1 to 10 scale. So this is where you then pull out the worksheet and say, Tommy, Sally, let's see how you feel about changing at this time. We reviewed the pros and cons of using, triggers and cravings, and what changing your use of pattern, sorry, there's a typo there, would mean to you. And so at the top is the 1 to 10 scale. And we just turn the page over to the teenager and have a mark it, or you can just tell them on a 1 to 10, with 1 being not ready, in the middle being somewhat ready, and 10 being very ready. What number would you give? You can put the score down. That kind of gives you a ballpark. You're welcome to ask the bottom half. Please circle one of the following statements that best describes your client right now, which you could read those aloud and have the youngster give you an answer, or you might already realize what the answer is and you can mark it. It's just helping you affirm kind of what temperature reading you're getting on the client's willingness to change. But we encourage you to really just focus on getting 1 to 10. It's very rare to get a 1, so that's good news. And anytime you get more than a 1, you want to congratulate the person or reaffirm, that's great. So there's a little bit of you, or some of you wants to change, or you're not totally uninterested in change. So that's great, Sally. Let's see, maybe we can move forward here today. And if you get a 1, that's all right. Hang in there. The odds are if they give you a 1, they're not ready to change anything about their drug use behavior, but you may already know the card I'm going to play soon. You want to see what else you can get them to talk about for change. Okay, then it's, as you might expect, you've moved along nicely within that first session. It's got a lot of directed exercises, and so you're probably 3/4 into the 1 hour. So it's time to get a discussion on goals. And as you anticipate, you want to make the goals realistic, specific, doable, relevant to the teenager. They can be in 2 rough categories. Obviously, you want to see if you can get some drug use goals agreed upon, or a drug use goal in the reduction or abstinence direction. And you also have an opportunity to change other behaviors that might be related to the person's health or their risk profile. So in terms of drug use goals, you could make a case that you have 3 options, 3 general options: abstinence, risk harm reduction, or monitor use. So abstinence is the best. It's worth floating it, suggesting this would be very interesting, Tommy, if you tried going the next 7 days without using. I wonder what that would be like for you. What do you think? Especially, what if they said they could control their drug use? What if they said yes on that one item? Well, it sounds like, Tommy, you said you could control. What would it be like for you to control to the point of not using for a week? See if that's an interesting challenge for the youngster that he or she might bite on. I recommend you bring that to the forefront. If they pull back, see what you can get the person to do in the risk harm reduction, which could mean many things. Risk harm reduction can mean reducing frequency, quantity, or the drug choice. How often, how much, go from polydrug to single drug, all of those are better. It's not great. Alter setting. What would be for a teenager that spends 9 months of the year in school, what would be an altered setting, one that would be a plus? Not using before school or not using during school. That would be better than if they're using while they're trying to learn. You might, if you had a heroin user and they're shooting up, altering administration would be harm reduction, but that's pretty rare in the teen years. So any option to getting a reduction is a plus. You're going to revisit abstinence in the second session. So what if teenagers don't want to change anything about their drug use? Throw into the mix the third option. Ask them to just monitor. Pull back on the old avoiding argumentation, or you're rolling with resistance, probably both. Pull back on it and see if you can get the teenager to agree to just keep track of one drug use behavior for the next 7 to 10 days. And have them pick something specific, and have them pick something that you figure they're doing a lot of. Because you want to set them up for an insight that, wow, I guess I do that a lot. Because that often happens when people get into habits, they don't realize how much they're doing something. And having them monitor something they're doing at a high base rate often is an eye-opener. Now, it's just a temporary trick. You're going to use this as leverage in the hopes that session 2, when they come back, and if it works, that might open up a little bit of the door for them to realize that this could be an issue in their life, or that they do it quite a bit, and that could be harmful, blah, 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 blah. But it at least keeps the drug use issue on the table, gives them one homework assignment. And so, but pick something specific with them, you know. So how many days you get high next week? Keep track of that, and when we return in our next session, you can tell me, you know, if that's one of them. How many days you use while you're in school, or blah, 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 blah. But you also have another option, don't you? You could set goals that are related to the teenager's life that are not irrelevant to drug use, but hopefully are promoting assets or reducing risks that could be favorable in altering drug use trajectory. And how would you know what could be relevant? This is where anything you got from the pros interview, the decisional balance part of the exercise that gave you the positives, all of those answers can translate for you on a health-related or personal-related goal. Because you're probably, if it's functional value drug use, then you know something about the teenager that they probably find as aversive or negative or something they'd like to have less of in their life. Less boredom, less anxiety, less coping problems, etc. You have a chance to enter into the therapeutic realm with the teenager on that level. It's not directly related to drug use, but it is related, and it keeps him or her in the game. And it's relevant, and it's not under the topic of drug use, which they might say is off limits. But what teenagers doesn't want to get rid of depression or anxiety or boredom or coping problems? You know, that it's an easier sell. You're not taking away something positive. You're trying to help them get rid of something negative. So now this is where your cognitive behavioral skills come into play, where then you have to, okay, how am I going to plug in, let's see, this teenager's problem looks like this, and I'm going to have a goal of the following that's trying to move the cognitive behavioral ball forward. This is where CBT skills come into play. Generic skills. What am I going to do to have them change either their cognition or their behavior to help go from poor functioning behavior to better functioning behavior? If it's a social anxiety issue, you got to try to figure out, okay, what's the source of this social anxiety? Are they bad at small talk? Do I have to get into a small talk skill development discussion with this teenager? Are they not engaging in any social behavior because they're too shy and so they're staying away? And do I have to then encourage them to rethink about their social life and encourage them to hang out and agree to go to, you know, talk to 4 kids for at least 5 minutes over the next week, you know, put it in behavioral terms. So you see what I'm doing here? I'm plugging in my knowledge of use of CBT. This admittedly is going to have to draw upon your own reserves of skill for this. If you have that skill base, this is a great entry point, and particularly useful if you're realizing I got a teenager that isn't all that interested on changing their drug use habits. Okay, that's a lot on goals. Comments, questions?
Are you going to talk about the parent stuff later, or?
Yes. We are not going to forget those parents. They are in the lobby waiting to come on in. Come on down, parents. Yes, they're coming up. They come in the 3rd session, though.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
How do you get your referrals? Are they?
Oh, hang on to that question. Question about referrals. We're going to talk about referrals as we get into implementation issues, which I'm going to bring up very soon. Yep. It's a very good point, because referrals and the type of referrals you get can dictate ways that you apply this. Yes?
I have a question. You mentioned a little bit earlier that we could tell the client that we're not going to disclose any information to the parents, trying to keep the privacy.
Yes.
I am concerned in regards to the ethics part of it and the laws and regulations, because since it's an informed consent that the parent has to sign, if the parent asks of you, you do have to give information to the parent.
Yep.
So how is that going to influence the relationship with the teenager?
Good. Hang on. Good question about informed consent. How much disclosure occurs? Hang on to that question. We're going to talk about that with the parent session and one of the key administration issues. I've got some thoughts on that, and also an important principle that everyone needs to make sure they understand based on where you work and what state you work in. But we'll get to that. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, no, you're stretching. You can stretch. Okay, so, well, worksheets, you have worksheets, you can fill out established goals. And that worksheet allows you to write some things about what you think might be getting in the way of the teenager reaching those goals from the discussion. But more formally, you're going to now look at a top, very common barrier to achieving goals in this arena, and that is the triggers and cravings get in the way. So the idea is to use the what sets off your drug use worksheet in a guided interview that helps you connect the triggers and cravings that you already know about and the goals. So you want to get them to talk about those triggers and cravings and talk about alternatives. How are they going to resist those? Because it's likely those would get in the way of at least the drug use goals that you've set. And even if the person said, I don't want to change my drug use, it's great to get into discussion about triggers and cravings and what could be an alternative to it. Even if it's an intellectual discussion with a teenager and they think it's fiction, to talk about it. You're planting some mustard seeds, getting the discussion out in the open, seeing if you can get some clinical script inside that teenager's head. So the manual guides you on how to then bring back the issue of triggers, how that the relevant ones that you already learned of from earlier, and how you get in discussion about, well, say, well, what could you do to resist those? What could you do to prevent that trigger from getting in the way? Now, the second session gets into some specific skills to deal with that. So it's okay if you're getting, I don't know, I'm not sure. That's all right. Just get the discussion out in the open about triggers and that there are alternatives. Even getting the question about there are alternatives. You know, there are ways to handle some of these things. It's not fate that you have to do blah, blah, blah in the face of blah, blah, blah. Second session, we're building in skills to help teenagers with specific or common ones. So it's just an opportunity to get the discussion out in the open. You may already connect the dots with the teenager. Oh, they got a goal. That goal is going to be faced with a trigger that could challenge that goal, and now I'm going to really help the teenager talk about how to avoid that trigger, because that would go against or help thwart efforts towards the goal. Okay, so it's a way to connect a couple things you've already done. You've already done triggers and cravings. You already set goals, and now there's an effort here to connect them. Okay, so it's a big session. It concludes with reviewing the goals, setting the appointment, and I think 7 to 10 days is a good one. We also give teenagers this worksheet. It's called Advantages of Not Using. We don't oversell this. We just provide the teenager with something they can bring home. Now, this is a list that came from teenagers that were asked to give insight about recovering teenagers, asked to give insight about what they have now learned about some advantages of not using now that they're in recovery. So it comes from a clinical sample, looking back on their lives and trying to learn from that. So it's an interesting list. It doesn't come from adults. We don't go through this list. We don't oversell it. An opportunity to give teenagers to take something home. Maybe they'll study it. Maybe they'll read it. But it's a handout. Nice the teenager comes away with something from one of the sessions. Common sense reasons. Okay, that was session 1. I don't want to move into session 2 until I can answer any session 1 questions. You can see it's a tight 60 minutes. If you have a talkative youngster, it can take longer. And some people have to break it off into chunks and come back for a second session. Try to do let's say you can't get it through everything in session 1 in one meeting. See if you can get a second meeting before the week. See if you can get it in a couple days so you can finish that session in the second meeting. Yes?
So in that case, you would want to actually have maybe 4 overall sessions.
Yes. So someone in the back row is doing the math. Exactly. So it's possible Teen Intervene might be more meetings than 3 because you're having trouble getting through all the exercises for the individual sessions. Right. good point. Now in school settings, got a lot of places that tell me, we only really, by the time a teenager gets to my office and has to go to their next class, they only have about 30 minutes of real time. So they're doubling. You know, for the teenager, it's not 2, it's 4, and then the fifth for the parent. You know, maybe they have the luxury with a parent.